Jonathan Glazer, writer and director, has adapted a novel into a film that's called The Zone of Interest. It's gotten 5 Oscar nominations this year. And the film follows the lives of Rudolf Haas and his wife Hedwig and their children as they try to create what looks at a glance like an idyllic life in the German countryside. You see them in their home, in their garden, going off to school, swimming in the river, enjoying family picnics, worrying over family visits, talking about possible promotions, sharing meals, talking about renovations in the house. So, very regular life type of stuff. Until you realize that Rudolph is a Nazi SS officer and that he's going off to work every day at Auschwitz, the concentration camp. And so they're literally right next door in this beautiful home with a garden and a short walk down to the river for picnics and swimming next to the concentration camp. And the sounds and the smells and the cries and the gunshots from the camp drift over the wall all day long because they live right next door. Rudolph at one point in the film gets a visit from his colleagues, but they aren't talking about sales numbers or corporate structure. They're discussing innovations to the gas chamber that Auschwitz is going to get. So you can imagine the weight of watching this film. I'm not spoiling it for you. This is all basically, the idea is right there in the preview. But the movie is disturbing on several levels, not least of which is watching this family move through their protected domestic life with its simple joys and concerns while they're actively carrying forward horrific evil. The film puts questions in front of us like, can you have tea in the garden wearing the confiscated coat of someone who's being shot or gassed 40 yards away? Can you swim with your children on a break from ushering thousands of people to their horrible deaths? The film asks, what can someone become complicit in? How can someone abandon their responsibility to their fellow human? How can evil dress up and play house? To see the Haas family living and working as if it's normal when we know that it's anything but, it begins over the course of the film to make you sick. And there's a scene at the end where this even registers for the family. The Zone of Interest is a stark contrast from many other, but from one in particular true story of the same era, World War II. In 1987, Pierre Sauvage released a documentary about a small French village, Les Chambon-sur-Lignon. Oh, Bastion said no. I said, when I pronounce it, I want you to tell me if I got it right. And he just said, So I tried, okay? Anyway, the film is called Weapons of the Spirit in English, and it's about this, Les Chambon is this obscure farming community that becomes this shining example of extraordinary courage in their time. They banded together as a community to hide and sustain over 5,000 Jewish men, women, and children during the war, from 1940 to 1944. So this documentary came out in 1987, and the Washington Post, commenting on the film, said, Pierre Sauvage's documentary about the extraordinary French village of Les Chambon during the Nazi rule during World War II is like a murder mystery in reverse. It's an examination of crimes that didn't take place, of atrocities averted, and in such a way that history itself seems to have been subverted by their absence. So how did they get there? The town folk, as you sort of hear their story, it doesn't sound all that remarkable. They just sort of realized, hey, this is coming to our doorstep, and we have a basic responsibility. Even though we know there were many other villages in Europe that did not take this same responsibility, but one of the priests or the pastors in the village knew that the community had a responsibility to their neighbors, and he said, we will resist when our enemies demand that we act in ways that go against the teachings of the gospel. We will resist without fear, without pride, and without hatred. We will fight with the weapons of the Spirit. And the striking part as you begin to hear these stories is how very ordinary the villagers of Les Chambon thought of their lives. They didn't imagine they were being greatly heroic at all. They were going about their days. They were farming their land. They were cleaning their homes. They were going to market. And they were also keeping their neighbors safe who needed help. There's a very real sense in the interviews of like, what could we have done? But we know from history there was so much else they could have done. So we contrast these two shocking, historical moments that are the same era and the same war, but utterly different. They're morally unrecognizable, but they're playing out in similar domestic lives, going to work, going to market, cleaning the house, talking about what's next week or the next day. Comparing the lives of the German Hosses and the French villagers, you might have seen really similar daily activities, but you would have also seen completely different vocations. And sometimes we need the extremities of our worst historical moments to bring to relief these types of considerations into our own lives, to start asking ourselves questions like, what might I become complicit in just drifting through my regular days? What might I give a yes to that if I was really asked, I would be shocked and horrified to find out that I had given a yes to? What way might I be missing my vocation as a human being just getting busy doing the regular stuff of my day? Here's the thing, we may find ourselves in circumstances that hopefully for the most of all of our lives are going to be far less intense than these two stories. But still, for all of our activity, we are responsible to understand, to grasp, and to live our vocation. We're talking in this Epiphany season about how we understand our purpose, how we understand our communal and shared purpose, how we understand our vocation as individuals, how Jesus coming as the light of the world impacts how we live as participants in and sharers of the light of the world. Vocation is maybe not a word we use enough or all that often in our lives, but it's connected to purpose. It's how we live out who we are. It's how we live out what we are about. And our lives are begging for coherence in what we are most fundamentally about and what we do. A lot of times when we trace stress and dis-ease and frustration and brokenness in our lives, there's a gap between what we know we want most to be about and how we're actually living. It's a failure of our responsibility, a failure of our vocation. Stephen Garber, an author and professor who's helped me a lot in thinking about vocation, he's written widely on it. He says, the word vocation is a rich one, having to address the wholeness of life, the range of relationships and responsibilities. Work, yes, but also families and neighbors and citizenship, locally and globally. All of this and more is seen as vocation, that to which I am called as a human being, living my life before the face of God. It is never the same word as occupation, just as calling is never the same word as career. Sometimes by grace, the words and the realities they represent do overlap. Even significantly, sometimes in the incompleteness of life in a fallen world, there's not much overlap at all. A question I want to put before us as a church is, what is your vocation? What is our vocation? We've been asking and trying to answer for several weeks now. And as you notice from what Alice read, we're going all the way back to a classic, spinning the hits this morning. Answering the question or starting to answer the question from the very beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures, from the very beginning of our story. The Hebrew creation story in Torah really stands out. Like, we're so used to it that our eyes can kind of glaze over with familiarity when we hear it. But this creation story in Torah stands out in the ancient world. So many of the rival myths of how the world was made began with violent conflict between the gods. In the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian example, one god tears another god apart and from their ripped body makes the world. Shalom. Right? It's anything but. But in the Genesis account, it's really remarkable because God doesn't seem to be in an active conflict that we can see. Basically, right from the beginning, you see there is no God like this God. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's this first sentence of the scripture. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. There's so much that we learn about the vocation of God from the very beginning of these first sentences of Hebrew poetry. The first is in the beginning, right? So at the very start, at the origin moment, it says Elohim bara. That's what it says in Hebrew. It's like God's breath. So we have this God, this creator figure. So in the beginning, this creator God is making something. It's God's breath. It's expending energy. It's the earth, and it says something about the state of the world before this moment. The earth was formless and void. Another translation is the earth was wild and waste. The Hebrew word rhymes. It's one of my favorite things to say, tohu vavohu. Yeah, you want to say it together? Let's do it. Tohu vavohu. You nailed that. Amazing. Good job. So, into this wild and waste. So the earth was formless and void, and Elohim barat, Elohim expanded, created. God shows up on the scene, and the first thing we see God doing is bringing order out of chaos. We've said this at Trinity Grace for years. The first thing we see God doing in the story is bringing order out of chaos. And we also see something about the nature and reality of God right here in the beginning of the story. And there's debate about this, but we have Elohim, who we're going to come to know as Yahweh, come to know as Father. There's also a word that is active in creation. The word is making the world. Now, one day in the biblical story, the word is going to become flesh and dwell among us. And we also have the Spirit of God hovering over the faces of the deep. So you have Yahweh, you have Elohim, you have the Word, the Spirit. We have this God, 3 in 1 in the story, who says, now let us make mankind in our image, in our text. We have a God who is in relationship, that matters, and yet one God, making a world, bringing order to chaos, bringing light. And there's so much debate about Genesis 1, and I just took a field trip with my son to the Natural History Museum, and we're talking about the origins of the universe and the planetarium, and the things that are being brought up, right? And yet there's, even in this like unbelievably beautiful, stunning scientific explanation of how our world got here, there's so many gaps, and they acknowledge them, right? There's so many things that are missing in the story. And honestly, there's so many things missing in this story. Because this story is not trying to tell you mechanically how the world was made in every detail and step. It's trying to tell us the meaning of life, how to interact with a God who's really there, what it means to be a human being. And when you start to read the Hebrew in the Hebrew, it's so clear that that's what it's doing. It's poetry, and it's literally like there are 7 letters in the first sentence, and like you just keep multiplying. It's this very obviously stacked poem that's directing you to its meaning so that you can't miss it. And it's not about, let me tell you scientifically how the world got here. It's about, let me tell you in your soul what human life is about. What it's like to live in with a God who is relationship. It's about Sabbath. It's about God resting and people resting, which is pretty important when you consider that this would have come into the story after Israel had been living in utter abject poverty and slavery in Egypt for 400 years. And then they get the story, what's God want you to understand your life is about? And in the center of that story is God resting. God working, God creating, but also God resting. So as the days of creation go forward, which we read some of it, we see this being, Elohim, the Word, the Spirit, hovering over the tohu vavohu, over the wild and the waste. We see this being separating and filling. And so we see some God vocation right here in the beginning of the story. In the first days 1, it's separating light from dark. Day 2, separating sky from water. Day 3, separating land from seas. And then in the next days, it's filling what was separated with sun, moon, and stars, filling what was separated with birds and fish, filling what was separated with animals and humans. And then on the 7th day, totally distinct from the rest of the creation order, God rests. So God makes, then God separates and fills. And what happens is there is order into the wild and waste, into the chaos, into the tohu vavohu. But you and I know it's not order like exactly like, okay, there are 6 books that will fit on this shelf very neatly, and this was chaos, and now we brought, it is order, but it's not just that. It's order, but it's also abundance. And so you can't help but read the creation story without seeing that it's sort of like bursting at the seams. So yes, it is order to the chaos, but this order itself is still, it's not boring, it's not stale, it's still thriving, full of life. One of my favorite commentators on this moment, Andy Crouch, says this: God's creative act brings forth not carefully regimented sets of creatures, but swarms of them. And anyone who's been near a swarm of honeybees, gone scuba diving among schools of fish, or seen a wheeling flock of sparrows over a grain field at sunset knows how awesomely unpredictable a swarm can be. Other translations use the word teeming, another word for incalculable and inestimable abundance. The Creator is not seeking a world of pets, individually domesticated animals bred to be attentive to their human master. He delights in wildness, different from chaos, but wildness. Swarming and teeming are part of what make the world good, the overflow and excess of life. All of this actually gives greater glory to God, who has breathed into existence the vast spaces of earth, sky, and sea where these creatures can teem. More so than would a meticulously tended backyard, the Creator loves teeming. So, vocation of God, separating, filling, order to chaos, pushing back the darkness. And so order is brought into the chaos, but also that order itself is still abundant and teeming. We would never look out at our world or go to Yosemite or stand at the edge of the ocean and say it's just order. It's also wild, abundant, overflowing goodness. So important that the story starts there. Before we get all of the tragedy and heartache and brokenness, right? The fall that leads to the Holocaust, right? There is a line connecting them. But before that, the story is good news, and that's really important. Over all of it, God keeps saying, this is good, good, good. He gets to humanity at the crown of creation, and he says, very good. Made in my image even. Let's look at it one more time. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, God's going to give us some vocation. You ready? God blessed them, said, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. He said that just before in the sentences above, rule, right? So we need to lean our ears close to this story because God is I've shared this with you guys, I feel like a million times, but when I was a little kid, I sort of had this picture that God was kicking around lonely in the dark. And he's like, I got to make some friends. And so he made people. And that's not the picture that Genesis 1 gives us at all. It's actually like this God is somehow vibrant in relationship, in community, in power, and pouring out, expanding, almost like an artist is like, I must make something that expresses who I am and share it with others. And God's creation is that. It is an expression of love expanded to us. And now there's an invitation to full participation in this incredible work of art that is human life and life on earth. A God unlike any other who is in deep relationship expands the space and invitation to people. And the thing that he tells us about ourselves is that we're made in God's image. Let us make human beings, male and female, in God's image. Now you tell me, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? To bear the Imago Dei. It's something we hear in church a lot. Maybe you've thought about it one time when I just asked you. Or maybe you've thought about it a million times. But what does it mean to be made in the image of God? The sort of intuitive answer that comes to me when I read this, and you have your own, and we'll see how they line up based on what I'm about to say, is that we're We're made for a relationship, that we have spiritual capacity, that we have some soul or animating reality to our lives that does make us distinct in a way from other elements of creation. And sometimes it's hard to tell just by how much we're distinct from other parts of creation, because they're really wildly sophisticated and intelligent and feel and make choices, absolutely. And so there's tremendous responsibility there. But there's no doubt that the story is telling us human beings are distinct in the world from the rest of creation. And part of it is their capacity for relationship with God in a knowing friendship type way. So I've always thought that's how we're made in the image of God. And I think certainly that's part of it. I think it's implied. I think it's intuitive. And I think it comes through in the rest of the story. But the function that's mentioned here for what it means to be made in the image of God is that we join in the work of the world. It's that we join in and participate with God in the work of the world, that we have a vocation to participate in. Being made in the image of God means joining with God in making good of the world. Adam and Eve were given good work to do, and this wasn't because sin came into the world, right? The first work day doesn't take place after the fall. Work is already there, participation, doing meaningful things. So our world is about relationship. We talk about that all the time, flowing out of the existence and reality of this triune God. But also our work is about, in our relationships, doing meaningful things for good, making good of the world, taking sounds and making a song, right? Taking wood and making a rocking chair. Taking ingredients and making a meal and spreading it before your friends. Taking an idea and growing it and germinating it and getting other people involved so that all of a sudden you're doing a wide good that you could not do on your own or out of your own, right? This is our calling and vocation as human beings, to join with God in doing good in the world. In the story, in the actual descriptions, it's cultivate. It's explore. It's you. I've been bringing order. I want you to bring order. Get to know these animals and give them a name. Right? I already sort of, as a kid, I don't know how you picture it, just sort of Adam sitting bored on a rock. Just another one coming by. Zebra. Turtle. And just like it just came to him. But like instead, I want you to imagine like them out in the middle of the expanse of Yosemite, like diving under the water and running through the fields and taking up specimens and poring over them and praying and walking with God and just like being amazed and delighted. It says this throwaway line, they walked with God in the cool of the evening. Can you imagine like he scoops up an animal, like what should we call it? And like this unbelievable, like fully immersed experience of doing good work in participation with God. That's the pre-fall picture. We hear ruling and dominion that God gives human beings, and we think of all the negative aspects of that from our history when people take their rule and distort it and twist it. And the American experiment is so much based on avoiding totalitarian power at all costs that we're averse to the word rule. But it doesn't mean what you think it means of like, absolutely imposing your will on something. It's participating and bringing that thing into its fruition. David Bruce Hegeman has written a really stunning small book called Plowing in Hope. And he says, human beings' cultural mandate, the call to rule, fill, and transform the earth was established before the fall and exists independently of our need for redemption. God clearly had an initial basic plan for the development of the newly created earth, which includes human beings' cultural involvement. What we're saying all this because we're trying to communicate that your vocation goes all the way back to the very center of the human story, to the very beginning. Tim Mackey from the Bible Project summarizes this as our vocation is to oversee creation as God's partners and representatives in the world. And when we fail at that, when basically God's saying, listen, I can show you and tell you what's right, what is and what isn't. I can show you the way to operate in the world. And our first sin, what is it? Our first sin is to say, no thanks, we're going to determine what's good and bad for ourselves. And we lose this essential part of our vocation. And the wreckage runs itself through the whole story. And even then, God says, I want you to participate with me in repair. God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a covenant of repair. It's about restoring what has been broken in our responsibility in the world. And ultimately, God's going to take the fullness on himself, but it's about a relationship and revelation and responsibility. That's Israel's covenant. Look at it. Relationship, calling by name, more revelation of who Yahweh is. And now take responsibility for your neighbor, for this land, for the blood of your brother. Take responsibility. You can't be walking through your garden ignoring the reality that you're complicit in the death camp next door. That's not my covenant of repair. And these categories in Genesis still work for us, for as ancient as they are and as draped in Hebrew poetry as it is, it still works for you and I for beginning to sort out questions of vocation for our own lives, even in Brooklyn in 2024. Rule, fill, work, preserve. You're like, I work at a coffee shop, man. What are you talking about? I'm in between jobs right now. Maybe you've had your dream job for 10 years and it's not so much of a dream anymore. Wherever you are in your career spectrum, I want to tell you, you have a vocation. And one of the things that we're called to do as followers of Jesus is to begin to discern our vocation. And some of it is absolutely shared, and you don't have to come up with it on your own. But some elements of who God has made you to be are unique to you, and nobody can live your story. Nobody can bring together the collection of events that have happened in your life and trauma and victories and DNA and experiences and passions and talents and come all together into the unique you that is you and embody that in the world, right? Everyone else is taken, so you should be you. Rule, fill, work, preserve. Have dominion, bring order, make peace, organize for thriving, right? This isn't about using power to manipulate. This is about walking with God in a dominion that Christ has actually recovered for us in the gospel. Fill, be fruitful. This calls for us as people, yes, to fill the world, but also to fill the world with songs and homes and meals and enterprises and good and on and on. Work. Make, create, innovate, clean, repair, edit, build, teach, dream, write, build a cabinet, repair an eye, make a latte, craft a lesson plan, build a pitch deck, comfort a mother in labor, coach a team, make something beautiful, sweep a floor, sell a house, argue a case, set a menu. You're made to work. It's deeply meaningful. It's why we do get a little listless when we're drifting in our vocation. What am I supposed to be doing? Because doing it helps inform us. And then we have to set it down. We have to Sabbath. Because otherwise it becomes our identity. We need this rhythm. Preserve, protect, guard, recycle, tend, manage. Manage resources with love. This is the human calling. So, nearing the end here, but God shows us his vocation. And then he expands that vocation to people made in his image with spiritual capacity for relationship with a soul, but also with work to do. And so where do we start with our vocation? We're joining with good in the world. Maybe that's too vague, so we're going to keep going for a minute. But like when you see good in the world, and right, defining that takes some work, but when you see good in the world, it's to join with God in that good and to say an amen with your life, with your energy, with your blood, sweat, and tears, right? It's to haggle with that customs officer to get the pack through so that you can run the clinic for those couple of days and discover like this woman who couldn't see is now seeing. This guy who thought that people were bushes is now driving his delivery truck way better. That's bringing good into the world. Right, and that's one example, and you have this in your daily routine, in your vocation, to join with good in the world, to push back darkness. Where do you see darkness, right? I was with I'm very conscious of don't do your good to be seen by other people. I just want to tell you, there was a group of people from this church back at Floyd Bennett Field yesterday, setting up, giving out supplies to our new migrant neighbors who have moved into to Brooklyn, and giving out shoes and giving out coffee and giving out snacks and trying to help people find medicine and trying to help people find suitcases, and just the pictures of people just standing there pushing back darkness. All the confusion and the political debate about should these people be here and should they be in this particular place in this way. And people said, I don't know, I'm just going to show up and show love here. Show welcome, show kindness. Here's a cup of cold water, here's a cup of coffee, here's some shoes. Will you see if they fit? But keep your feet warm. Bring order out of chaos. Like a story like Les Chambon and hiding those Jewish men and women and children, 5,000 of them in 4 years. It's important because it raises the stakes for us. It starts to get our attention. But we are all called to work in the details of our lives with our souls aware of how the realities of our neighbor impact us. Because there's so much brokenness. We talked last week about the information overload that we live in, and it can become paralyzing and make us numb. But here's the reality. Stephen Garber, I'll give you one more time. The story of sorrow is not the whole story of life. There's also wonder and glory, joy and meaning in the vocations that are ours. There is good work to be done by every son of Adam and every daughter of Eve all over the face of the earth. There are flowers to be grown, songs to be sung, bread to be baked, justice to be done, mercy to be shown, beauty to be created, good stories to be told, houses to be built, technologies to be developed, fields to farm, and children to educate. All day, every day, there are both the wounds and wonders at the very heart of life. If we have eyes to see, and seeing, this is so important, learning to know, to pay attention, is where vocations begin. If there's one spiritual practice I want to call you to in discerning your own vocation, is this: pay attention. Don't move through the world numb. Don't move through the world just absolutely bombarding yourself with so much information that you can't make sense of any of it. Pay attention. This is where our vocations begin. In the Genesis story, it's paying attention to this creator God, expanding and teeming abundance, saying, join in with me and participate. The same reality is true for you and I. Pay attention to what? Pay attention to God. Learn to talk and listen. This is our vision as a year at Trinity Grace, to expand our prayer life, to expand our talking and listening to God. Pay attention to God. Pay attention to your own life. Do you think God's kicking around saying, I can't believe that you struggle with concentration so much? I can't believe that you were never good at math and you're better at words, right? I can't believe that you like this food and not that food, right? We are so hard on ourselves for the particularities of who we are, and some of the times those are the absolute clues God has given to us for our vocation in the world. No one else can do you like you. Pay attention to God, and in conjunction in a relationship, pay attention to your life, and then also pay attention to your community. And if you need help learning to do any of these, that's what our church is for. We are here to help you pay attention to God, pay attention to your own life made in the image of God, and pay attention to your community. Trish, I feel like I reference her every week, but she's our director of Good Neighbor Collaborations, because one of the things Patricia Manwaring is really good at doing is paying attention to her neighbors. And so she helps the rest of us get involved in serving them because she's listening. She has a coffee shop, which is a nice front door for doing that listening. Pay attention to God. Pay attention to your life. Pay attention to your community. I asked earlier, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And I'll say this as we really do wrap up, okay? Being made in the image of God, spiritual capacity, having a soul made for relationship. It's also the function of doing work in the world. It's a function of sharing a vocation with God. This word image shows up all through the Hebrew Scriptures. And not maybe in the way that you might first think it would. It shows up in the Hebrew Scriptures as idols, right? What's God's instructions to the Hebrew people about making images? Anybody? Don't do it. That's pretty much the summary. Don't make graven images. Don't make graven images of God. Now, my entire childhood, I keep talking about my childhood, but I thought this was about God saying, you're never going to get me right, so don't make a picture of me, okay? That we would somehow reduce God. And I think that's certainly part of it, that if you make something with your hands and then you start to try to worship that thing, you're going to distort the real image of who God is. But you want to know the other reason why God says, don't make an image of me? Because he already has. He already has. You. So not only do making idols and things that don't work as God into gods and worshiping them with our attention, affection, and devotion as if they're gods distort who God is in our minds, it also distorts us, our image of ourselves. And you know what we do most often is we give away responsibility. The crops didn't grow because such and such, God didn't help us. Right? Our neighbors got crushed because there was nothing we can do, right? And we give away our responsibility. God has made us in his image with vocation and responsibility and revelation and relationship. That's his covenant with his people that he fulfills in Jesus. Making an image would distort God in our minds, but it would also distort our vocation that we are responsible for this world, to participate with God in bringing good into it. Such a temptation for all of us with our vocation is to pass it on to someone else. Someone else will do it. So where do you start, you personally, with knowing your vocation? It might be different from your job, different from your hobbies and pastimes. What's your purpose? This is the kind of question I want you to ask. Put it in a journal. Talk about it with your friend, with your partner, in your life group, with your parents. Pay attention to God in prayer. Pay attention to your life. There's a whole bunch of literally ancient spiritual disciplines in the Christian life for doing these two things, to pay attention to God and pay attention to your life. So you're praying, you're meditating, you're talking to God, you're sitting in silence, you're reflecting and journaling and thinking and developing and remembering every time that you're made in God's image with responsibility, and you're paying attention to your community. You're choosing love. There's this wild thing in Revelation 21. We're not going to get into it really, but it's almost a throwaway. It says that the best of human culture is gathered up and brought into the New Jerusalem. In Revelation 21, it says that the glory of the nations is brought in there. I don't know everything that means, but I think there's going to be some songs that we sang here, there. I think there's going to be some recipes that were developed here that are going to show up there. I think there's going to be some city infrastructure that was imagined here that shows up there. I think there's going to be some carryover. There's going to be some things that you start now that you're going to complete later. There's going to be some projects that go on. There's going to be some reality to, some of what we do is going to go up as dust, but some of it is going to carry on. It's going to be gathered into because it is good, because it is vocational, human, God stuff. We're going to come to the communion table as we always do, and I want you to come with these questions in your mind and heart. The music folks can begin making their way up. I see that hand. Are there things God is inviting you to care about, and you know it? As soon as I stop talking, you can name it. Something God is calling you to care about in your world. Is there darkness you know you can push back? Maybe it's anxiety in a kid's life. Maybe it's confusion at your job because of some gossip. Just begin to imagine. Let the Spirit direct your imagination. Is there darkness that you could push back? Maybe order that you could bring into some chaos in your world. What are you gifted with? What are you passionate about? What can you endure in that maybe others struggle to? Right? You've just got a capacity to handle things in a certain area of life, and you can't do everything, but you can do this. What's the thing? Maybe, is this too dramatic? Where can we fight against evil with the weapons of the Spirit? love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control. What's your vocation? How do you understand your life mission? That's what I want to invite you to pray and consider in these last moments of this service, what your vocation is. And if you could be so bold as to begin jotting it down in the days ahead or this morning, I think that would be a really beautiful start for us, paying attention to God, to our lives, to our community. We have a beautiful opportunity to pay attention to God right now in this meal. So let's stand to our feet, prepare our hearts for receiving this meal, this broken body and shed blood of Jesus. I'm always struck that this reading we read every week says we take this in remembrance of Jesus. It is a remembrance of what he has done in his broken body and shed blood, but it is also a remembrance of his vocation to heal and repair the world. And that we have a share in that because of Christ's finished work. We don't do it all. We participate in what God has done and is doing. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Church, I want to invite you forward to receive this meal, to pay attention to God in this meal, how much you are loved, his body broken, his blood shed, to say to you, yes, you're a part of my family. Yes, I have work for you to join with me in. And then to process by the Spirit those questions. What is God calling you to? What is your vocation as a human being? Space up here if you want to kneel or change your posture in any way as you pray. Sometimes that helps. There'll be people up at the front to pray with you, and then we're going to continue worshiping. And in the poetry of this moment, Heavenly Father, help us to pay attention to you. Lead us by your Spirit. Bless this meal. Bless your church as she receives it. In Jesus' name.